hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's on the cusp of morning and afternoon, so I hope hello will do. I'm Geoffrey Baskerville, and I hardly need to introduce Blake Morrison, who is one of our finest poets in the UK, and a man of writings of other kinds, novelist, journalism, non-fictional writing. At the moment, we're going to begin by discussing Blake's most recent collection of poems, Shingle Street, and I understand that Blake is going to sign books afterwards in the other half of the tent here. So do please bear that in mind, and I'll remind you again at the end of it. A complex literary career, Blake, is I think what we're looking at here. But can we start with the new book? Now, this is your first collection in 30 years. How has it taken so long?
Well, it's the first full collection in 30 years. That's to say, they're all new poems. They're all written in the last 4 or 5 years. I don't know. Michael Longley, the poet, once said to me that there are only young poets and old poets. There are no middle-aged poets. Middle age is mortgages and children, and poetry dries up. So maybe it was that. But I started as a poet. I wrote the memoirs, 3 novels, and then that seemed to stop, and the poetry resumed. And it, I'm not sure how much you can will it. It's just the natural part of your life.
Was there a point at which you thought, no, now is the time? I've got enough sitting here. I've had this poem that's been sitting here for 2 or 3 years.
Well, I'd have
a single thing. It sort of makes a collection.
I thought there were enough there for a collection. Yeah.
But they do fall into quite distinct themes within the 40 poems in here, and the first are really what I would describe as sea poems. I don't know if you would say that is a reasonable description of them, but particularly the opening poem talking about the sea taking the coast away.
Yeah.
So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about why it's called Shingle Street and what Shingle Street is, and why the sea is an important metaphor in all of this.
And perhaps I could read something. Do you think?
Would you like to? Would you read now?
Well, I could.
Please.
It might help rather than. And I feel it's discourteous to read poetry from a seated position. I'll just read. I'll read this. We all carry landscapes in our head. I grew up in the Yorkshire Dales, and that landscape's been very important to me. But also for the last 30 years or so, I've been going to East Anglia, to Suffolk, to that coast. And I've been really struck by the changes on that coast, and that's partly what gave rise to this book. This little poem is called Covive, a place on the east coast, Suffolk. Covive. The tides go in and out, but the cliffs are stuck in reverse. Back across the fields they creep, to the graves of Covive Church. From church to beach was once a hike. Today, it's just a stroll. Soon, it'll be a stone's throw. And that path we took along the cliffs has itself been taken by winter storms. The wheat's living on the edge. What's to be done? I blame the dead in their grassy mounds, the sailors and fishermen longing to be back at sea, who, since they can't get up and stride down to the beach, entice the sea to come to them. Shingle Street is a place, a rather marvellous place actually, a very remote spot in Suffolk. And one thing about publishing this book is that the number of people I've met who tell me, oh, I've been to Shingle Street, I've stayed at Shingle Street, I know why you've written about it. And the title poem is called The Ballad of Shingle Street. It's not... A ballad tells a story, and I guess there isn't a story as there is in The Ballad of the Yorkshire Ripper about Peter Sutcliffe, but the story is coastal erosion, and beyond coastal erosion are environmental change and rising sea levels and so on. So it's a real issue of our day, if you like. But I've just been struck by the changes on that coast, as I say. And the other story is that Shingle Street, there's always been local gossip and rumour about an episode that took place there during the Second World War, where possibly, or maybe not, Many people died in a conflagration on the beach. Were they Germans? Was a German invasion thwarted? Was it some Allied experiment that went wrong? Nobody knows, but there's a lot of rumours. Anyway, I'm just going to read a sort of slightly edited version of the ballad. It began trudging along the shingle, and I got that sort of rhythm in my head, so it's a very rhythmical and rhyming kind of poem. On Shingle Street, the summer's sweet, the stones are flat, the pebbles neat, and there's less rip when tides are neap. It's fine to swim, or fine to try, but when the sea runs fast and high, and skies turn black and cormorants weep, best watch your step on Shingle Street. On Shingle Street, the shelving steep, with stones to skim as if they'd feet, to hop and skip across the deep, to pitter-pat an aquaplane. Again, 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 not flip and flop and splash and drop, the open trap, the hangman's rope, the cairns that mark where life gave out, the muddy dark off Shingle Street. From Shingle Street to Bordsey Bay, the seamews shriek above the spray, the rolling seals are charcoal grey, as though burnt out or singed by grief. Like Ash Street mourners half possessed, they duck and bob and stare to land in hope that we might understand. But nothing helps. We fail the test. They hang and gaze without relief beyond the reach of Shingle Street. For Shingle Street's single street, a row of shacks in stone and wood, the sea out front, the marsh out back, just one road in and one road out, with no way north except the spit, and no way south except on foot. A cul-de-sac, a dead-end track, a sandbanked strand to sink a fleet, a bay, a bar, a strip, a trap, a wrecking ground. That's Shingle Street. From Shingle Street to Orford Ness, the waves maraud, the winds oppress, the earth can't help but acquiesce. For this is east, and east means loss, a lessening shore, receding ground, 3 feet gone last year, 4 feet this, where land runs out and nothing's sound. Nothing lasts long on Shingle Street. On Shingle Street, the grind goes on, a churning bowl of sand and stone, a watery mix that unbuilds homes, unearthing earth, unlaying land. Tall waves that flash like silver spades, and bulldozed buffs and quarried bays, not give and take, but take and keep. Just shingle left on Shingle Street. For Shingle Street's a sinking street, the worn-out coasts in slow retreat, with lopped-off bluffs and crumbling cliffs, and empty air where churches stood, and houses perched, and fields and woods, and no known means to stop the rot. A breaker's yard of rusted hulls, where combers come, and herring gulls, a holding bay for washed-up trash, a rest home for the obsolete, a hole, a heap, a wreck, a rack, a nomad's land. That's Shingle Street. On Shingle Street, the sea repeats its tired old tricks, its one-man show, the drum-rolled waves along the strand, the bass-line thud and cymbal clash, as stones are stoned and pebbles dashed. Again, 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 the waves collapse, the flints resound, the tide runs in and takes the ground, the tide runs out, the ground slips back. Variety is not the name, but that's the point. The sea's the same, unchanging grey, the one sure thing, a flooded plain in plain disguise, a level field that hides its rise through constant ebb and constant flow, unlike the earth, which shifts and shrinks, unlike ourselves, who have to go. I'll just read one more short one from this. This is really an anecdote of something that I saw at another of these places along the east coast, Dunwich, famous for as a once thriving medieval port where there were 20-odd churches, all since lost under the sea. People speak of hearing bells tolling on certain nights, and there's a famous photograph of a church where you see it fully standing and then half of it gone and then completely gone. Anyway, this has nothing to do with that at all. It's called The Discipline of Dogs. In the cafe on Dunwich Beach, I saw a woman buy a 99 and give her spaniel first lick. Its tongue neatly curling to detach the twirly flourish at the tip, and resisting even a nibble of the serrated chocolate flake poking sideways from the middle. Her trust rewarded, she then tucked in, and beseechingly though the pooch stared and slavered from her lap, the woman wouldn't let up till every last mouthful was gone, even the blonde hollow butt end of cone. My apologies to dog lovers for whom that is a normal activity.
Blake, this is a world of things vanishing. Even the ice cream cone in its state with the dog. The word in Shingle Street that came to mind, that leapt out at me, is loss.
Yeah.
You know, that all of this, in a sense, is to do with perhaps the world losing sight of itself, a genuine sort of diminishing of the world in which we live. I mean, are you a melancholy poet by nature, or is this just something which has come out of the observation?
Probably I'm melancholy by nature, not in the writing, perhaps not in the person. But you know, it's an undisputed fact that coastal erosion, and of course, perhaps I'm more attuned to it now at the age that I am. So the loss, I mean, it's partly a book about aging and mortality. There's no doubt about that. It's not just about. I mean, you see in certain landscapes what you want to see, what's relevant to you at that time of your life, and yes, what I see is a diminishment.
Well, that's a sort of Hardy-esque view, isn't it, of reading the landscape in terms of your mood, or at least your perception of where the world is. I noticed that you quote from Hardy as a preface to one of the poems, Happiness.
Yes.
And I'm not quoting exactly, I think, but at the end of it, it said that everybody that you love and care for is still alive when last you looked. You know,
yeah, last time you heard everybody's still alive. Yes. That Hardy has a poem. Well, he has a definition of happiness. Should we find it?
Yes.
Because it's so good. But the occasional episode in a general drama of pain. So this is my attempt to write a poem about happiness, because normally I think, you know, as Larkin said, quoting some French poet, you know, happiness writes white. You know, the good, most books are about conflict, difficulty, pain, loss, death, and not happiness.
And yet there's an enormous amount of perception of the passing moment in that landscape, the way in which you talk about trudging along the beach, which produces the rhythm and the trenchant sound of the opening poem. But laced into that is the observation of the individual moments of what the water is doing, what the beach is doing, how the light is catching it. Are you always responsive to that on any occasion?
All I can say is that walking along that coast, going for walks, is almost invariably, you know, some image will come and I'll write something down, and sometimes poems will get started that way. I'm sure that's why I resumed writing poetry, actually, just walking around that area.
Did you write them in Suffolk, or did you actually
write nearly all of them written in...
They're written in situ?
Mostly, yeah. Well, certainly begun in situ.
Is that because it's difficult to write in the city, or just because it was so immediate an impulse?
The poems belong to that place, I suppose. I can work in the city and revise in the city. Mm-hmm. They were revised in.
So you're not recollecting your emotion and tranquility somewhere else.
Yeah, I'm not sort of prima donna-ish about where I have to work in order to write. You know, certain writers are, and have to sort of decorate their room in certain ways to be inspired. But I haven't particularly found that. I could write things down on train journeys or whatever.
I mean, is there a specific moment of impulse? I remember hearing a different medium, but the composer Michael Tippett describing how he was sitting in some concert with a friend, listening to somebody else's music, and suddenly something about the gesture of the music tripped something in his brain, and he turned to his friend and said, "I've just started a new symphony, and it took 4 years to do, but there was a defining moment when something took shape, something hooked on inside." Does that resonate with you? Do you suddenly find that something is hooked on inside?
Occasionally. I mean, those are the rare, wonderful moments when that happens. But to take the Shingle Street poem, I mean, that certainly, I was consciously walking up down, listening to the sound, trying out rhymes for quite a long time before starting to write that poem.
We should also look at some of the other poems. When you move on from the sea poems, and I strongly recommend Flotsam as well, which is perhaps more descriptive of the actual sea in itself. You know, the sea all frills, it flounces in with a roll of the eyes and lift of under things, and so on. It actually describing the sea rather than what the sea is doing, and it's a lovely poem. But you then go on to sort of poems of contemporary circumstance, almost satirical poems, where the poem actually identifies itself. This poem.
Yes. Well,
becoming a
I published a pamphlet called This Poem before this full collection a couple of years ago. Anybody who's been to a poetry reading will know the experience of the poet standing up saying, this poem was written on this occasion, this poem's about this poem's about that. So I thought I'd make every poem in this pamphlet begin this poem. And actually I found it a sort of good mantra for getting going, just like, for instance, is the famous creative writing exercise, I remember, and it's amazing how that does often work for people. Something gets triggered. And I found this quite helpful. Shall I read it?
Yes, please.
A couple of these to give the idea, so I have to stand again now. Yeah, well, the first one I think of them that I wrote was called Bonus. There was a lot in the newspapers about bonuses, and I was thinking how often I've had a bonus, i.e. never. But then I thought, well, maybe, yes, for a poet, a bonus is a poem, especially if you've not been writing one for a while. Anyway, this is called Bonus. This poem is my annual bonus. I know, most folks slog away for a modest return with no extras, and their work's in the public interest, teaching and healing and cleaning and stuff, but I'm a poet, and who are you to interfere if the powers above choose to reward me? Remember the value of the words I generate and all I contribute to the cultural economy. Be warned, if you deprive us poets of our bonuses, we'll be forced to move and work abroad in a different language. And London will lose its place as the poetry hub, the Western world. Is that what you want? No. I thought not. You're just jealous of the cats that get the cream. Go on, admit it. We're worth our bonuses. Every stanza, every line break, every half rhyme. Geoffrey asked me to read this one, which is, well, it needs no explanation really. It's called Call Centre. This poem is an automated response system. To activate it, please slowly speak your name. I'm sorry, but your personality has not been recognised. Please wait while I transfer you to one of our inoperatives. Your call is extremely important to us. Please take a moment to enjoy the silence. We are experiencing an unusual volume. Please keep your voice down. You now have 3 options. Death from boredom, death from apoplexy, death by suicide. Thank you. Your complaint has been referred to our satisfaction unit, where it will be answered with due coarseness.
I think it's a wonderful selection. There's only a few of the poems in the pamphlet in this particular collection, but there's, just to enumerate a couple, there's one on hacking. This poem has been hacked into. One called Prism. This poem is a surveillance device. And I particularly like one which it's called the Riot. This poem is a riot, and it sort of ends, Once it's finished its sentence and next August comes around, the poem plans to write again. It's a wonderful collection. This sort of desire to satirise contemporary events or contemporary circumstances in life. I mean, did they just pop out, or are you sort of an angry?
No, I don't think I'm that angry, but I mean, you read stuff in the newspapers and you don't feel you've got the energy to write, do all the work and research for a 240-page book about surveillance. You're not qualified to do that, but sometimes a short poem can perhaps say something that amuses or identifies.
And tee up other people's thoughts on the matter.
Yeah.
I mean, I ask it with another reason in mind, because others of your works, in poetry, the Ballad of the Yorkshire Ripper, and I suppose in print, in prose, the As If about the James Bulger case, have really identified social circumstances around particular socio-political events. What actually made you think that, certainly in the case of the Yorkshire Ripper, that poetry was the right medium to deal with a very, very touchy subject?
Well, I suppose in both cases there was a feeling that the media behave as if they own a story. The Yorkshire Ripper serial killing of 13 women in Yorkshire in the north of England back in the 70s, 80s, and then the Bulger case, the 2-year-old boy killed by 2 10-year-olds. The media feel it's their property, and there's endless newsprint and so on, and sometimes a lack of insight. I read a very good book by Gordon Byrne about Peter Sutcliffe, which seemed to me to explain him in a way that acres of newsprint hadn't, as a misogynist, as a man who'd grown up in this woman-hating family, who'd gone out to, as he told his brother, clean up the streets, our kid, I was just cleaning up the streets. And to me that made this a story worth telling, because it wasn't about a one-off psychopath. It was about a general cultural, a culture that Sutcliffe had grown out of, and it was mine. He'd grown up not far from where I grew up. So, and I thought a ballad might be a way of attacking that. Ballads tell a story. But what really happened with that one was that, having written the ballad, 100 stanzas, it felt very flat and dead. It was in straight English, and what brought it alive was the Yorkshire dialect. Some dialect words that I knew from childhood, and some that I sort of researched, that we found this glossary of dialect words. And what was interesting was that how many dialect words were abusive of women, were themselves kind of steeped in misogyny. And so the language of the poem, there's a narrator who tells the story. It's not my voice; it's the voice of somebody else telling the story. But I think to me, it was a way of reclaiming that story, not for literature as such, but to provide insights that hadn't been there.
Well, when I read it, it struck me that it gave it an enormous emotional heft in a way that simply reportage doesn't. And it's not an excuse for the Ripper either, is it? I mean,
No.
But it is very much an anatomization of elements of a culture in the way that likely you can do with this poem, but you can actually dive under. In the Bulger case, I mean, the As If book, it's written in prose, but there are sections of it where it almost verges on poetry. I mean, you wouldn't agree to it, I'm sure, but I could go through some sections of this and write it out as lines, particularly the ones where you're looking back at childhood, when you're looking at formative influences on things. I mean, you wrote about your own experiences with your father, and we were talking earlier, and you said that there were moments when something that had been a poem actually then turned the other way and became prose in the book. Yes. Perhaps you could explain a bit about that.
Yes,
the difference between the two and the context in which they fall.
Yeah, if I could start just on the Bulger book, and in a way the connection with the Ripper poem was, I mean, like most people in the country, I suppose I was kind of gripped and horrified by that case, and then I had the opportunity to go to the trial in Preston back in 1993, and having written a long piece for the New Yorker who'd sent me there, I still felt I hadn't really said what needed saying, and so it was a book of several years' research and reflecting on childhood. And I guess the main point was that those two boys who had done a terrible thing had been vilified, had been seen as psychopaths, again that word, from this distant planet, evil, and I wanted to situate them in the real world, and in particular in the world of childhood, because they were 10 years old, and the sight of two 10-year-old boys standing in that courtroom, certainly in the case of one of them not really fully understanding what was going on, it seemed very wrong to me. I don't think an adult court is the right place for children to be tried, however terrible the crime. And it's our laws are different in that respect. Almost any other country in the world, 10-year-old boys could not be put on trial, and certainly not identified at the end of the trial as happened. So, I did feel a kind of anger about that, or a desire to not apologise for what they'd done, but to explain the context to it. And to give one example, you may remember the circumstances of the boy being abducted from the shopping centre and walked to a railway line where he was killed. Well, what those two boys did was they were actually walking back to their own neighbourhood with that boy. They were bumping into people they knew. They were heading towards the school where they were truanting that day. It wasn't some remote spot. It was their own neighbourhood. And when they got to the end of a road, very near where one of the boys, Robert, lived, his house one way, police station the other way, and they couldn't go to the police station. They were afraid of getting into trouble. How do you explain? You've got this little boy with you. Can't go to Robert's house where his mum is furious because he's truanted. That's when they went on the third direction, was up onto the railway bank. So there's that sense of them doing this terrible thing in order not to get into trouble with their mums or with the police or whatever. Now, that kind of, to me, that was a sort of, doing that walk was a kind of insight into how a 10-year-old might panic and think, this is the solution. And I guess that's the sort of thing that I felt hadn't come out in the reporting and needed say.
Well, it was publicly prefaced by John Major saying we should understand a little less and condemn a little more,
yeah.
Which is a shocking thing for any politician to say. And you got flack from some writers for this book, Hilary Mantel particularly.
I can't remember that one, but
luckily
I can't.
She goes into the early life of Thomas Cromwell. She seemed to take exception to you going into the childhood of these children.
Of course I got flack for it. From some people who didn't want to have to think again about it. From some people who thought the book was too personal, because that was another deliberate tactic I took. All the reportage at the time was written sort of by, as it were, upright citizens who'd never done anything bad in their life. That's the impersonal reporter, and I put rather a lot about myself into it as a way of saying, well, this is personal. It felt very personal in that courtroom, very intimate courtroom with parents and everything else, and I felt, drawing on one's memories of childhood was a way of looking at childhood, and that was where that crime originated.
I mean, is there something intrinsically about the material or the way that you wanted to deal with it that made it come out as prose and not as poetry, whereas The Ripper came out as poetry and not as prose?
I think the other thing that had happened in the meantime is that I'd written the memoir of my father. I'd stopped writing poetry after the Battle of the Orchard Ripper. That it seemed to have given me up, and
it gave you up.
It gave me up, and then I wrote the memoir of my father, which in some ways was more personal and emotional than the poems had ever been, and there was a voice in that, and I thought I could use that voice again, the narrator telling this story about a public event as well as I had about a much more personal death, my father's.
And you mentioned when we were talking earlier that there was a section in that which in your memoir about your father which started out as a poem but became prose. Could you read it?
Yes, it gives you my father. for those who've never met him, there usually is somebody in the audience who says, I knew your dad. He was a doctor in Yorkshire, and this began. This was originally written out as a poem, and I felt my father, couldn't be confined in a poem or even a long poem. There was something too chaotic and messy and big about him for that, and that's why this ended up as prose. This is an episode from the time after he'd been diagnosed with his cancer, and I was toing and froing between London and Skipton. Here I am at Leeds Station. The London train is running late. I wander over to where the mail vans used to gather, the scene of one of my father's great stories. He'd come down to see me in London, a £1 winter special day return, and had arrived at the station with only 5 minutes to spare. The visitors' car park was full, so he had left his car, a sporty drop-head orange Fiat, parked among several post office vans on the station forecourt. It was illegal, he knew, but he was rushing. Just how illegal he saw on his return. A posse of mail vans enclosed it, a tight red "get out of this one" circle. Improvising quickly, he asked at station enquiries, has anyone seen an orange sports car? It's mine, I've a set of keys for it. But my son was supposed to leave it in the car park. And it's not there. He was directed to a guard and then to an angry trio of post office workers. Oh Christ, he said, when they escorted him to where, as he knew, the car was parked. The daft sod. Student, is he? One of the guards asked, calming down. Yep, bloody student, my dad said. Supposed to be clever. Prize fathead, if you ask me. He rang me that evening, exultant. You should have seen their faces, absolutely livid. There must have been 10 mail vans boxing me in. But by the time I left, we were all great pals. Best thing of all, they'd have charged me £3.50 in the car park. I didn't pay a penny. See, I think it has to be prose, don't you, really?
Yes, but you can see the ghost of the poem in it,
maybe,
I think.
Maybe. I was going to say, the book about my father, it does have those comic moments. It's also about his decline and death. And I suppose in an odd way, I did feel also an agenda, as with writing about coastal erosion or writing about the Bulger case or Sutcliffe, to say something, and that was to do with honesty about death, because my father, a doctor, had always been very candid with me. There were too many conversations around the dinner table, in a way, between him and my mother. She too had been a doctor, about illness and disease and so on, and his view of death had always been, it's best avoided for as long as possible, but it's not like in the movies, and a terrifying thing. And with this in mind, when my grandfather died and I was 8 years old, he took me to see my grandfather lying in an open coffin, and said, well, that's it, there's death, son, that's what it looks like. Not to be afraid of, eh? But, I'm not sure I recommend this as a policy to adopt with children, but I understood his motive, and in a way I felt I had his permission to talk about his decline and death, with that sort of honesty in mind.
I mean, I was just struck by what you said about poetry left you. I mean, it's a very graphic way of putting it, as if somehow the inspiration walked into another room somewhere, and you're left writing about not inconsiderable things, the question of mortality, the relationship that people have with their parents, or your father, subsequently your mother, a separate book about your mother. And then poetry comes back to you, quite obviously. Does it mark a stage in your development as a poet as well? Are you a different poet than the poet that was the poet when the poetry left you?
Yes, I think so. I think there were just two collections And the first one was called Dark Glasses, and one of the reviewers said, yeah, but you can't see his eyes, and I suppose you can't see his heart. And the poems were not utterly impersonal, but I felt there was, oddly enough, the book about my father was far more emotional than personal. Now I've come back to poetry, I think they're probably more personal, and they're very direct, and they're also more formal. I mean, I use rhyme more than I did. Not all the poems are rhymed, but I certainly use.
No, certainly.
And even that little, the woman, the ice cream, and the dog that done it. That's actually a sonnet. But so I am using forms, trying forms like sestinas and so on that I never did when I was in phase one.
I mean, we probably don't have time to go into some of the things about how you formulated your voice as a poet, but I would be interested to know, and I'm sure others would be interested to know, where you feel you stand in the contemporary poetry field. Are you part of a particular movement or style that you would identify yourself as being in,
No.
or totally independent in your approach to it?
When I started out, I had a sense of belonging to a particular generation. I was very friendly with Andrew Motion. We edited the Penguin Book of Contemporary British Poetry together. And he has a book called Secret Narratives, and we're both quite interested in stories that were mysterious and open-ended, and that had an element of narrative, but were poems that withheld their meanings and answers. At the same time, there was also that Martian school you might remember with Craig Raine, and that probably had an influence. Now, no, I don't. I feel a bit cut off from other poets, and certainly younger poets.
Is that liberating?
No, it's more scary, really. You just feel you're a bit of an outsider in this world, and I felt very nervous about this book coming out because it had been such a long time. I mean, I do try and read poets and younger poets, and it's not that I dislike what some of them are doing, but I just it's not my voice, it's not my technique.
It's probably a moment for members of our audience to ask you questions if you would like to. Anybody? Excuse me. I'm sorry. Anybody wanting to ask questions? If so, we can provide a microphone to do so.
Who need the microphone at the front?
Everybody needs
The people at the back might.
question.
I'm just curious to know, having had both the caring parents, were you the only child?
No, I have a sister who's
And what age is she? Is she younger or older?
she's 16 months younger than me.
And you see her from time to time?
From time to time. She's still living in Yorkshire. We get on perfectly well when we do see each other, but not as often as I once did. It's true.
Really, the other thing is, where are you going from here? Where are you going from here? I'm going to go to
I've written 3 books on ecology, and I would love you to think about it, especially you were talking about the sands, and you're aware of the change of tide and happening, and very much so in ecology would be very interesting.
Might be beyond me, So, I think the poet just has to observe, and yes, of course you read and you do research and so on, but in the end they are poems, and I leave the ecology to the ecologists. Polyhagans.
Do we?
We must all look out for Polyhagans' work on ecology. Yeah.
We have a very reticent audience here. I don't see it.
No, there's
There's a lady over there, and then.
I just wondered if you could say something about your relationship to language and vocabulary. And particularly in the part of Shingle Street that you read, I mean, that just seems to have such an intricate, energetic vocabulary, and I wondered whether that was something that you refound when you refound poetry, and or whether actually you have a conscientious way of building and sustaining your sort of linguistic store cupboard.
I think you're right. I think I did. There was a sort of energy in that I hadn't had for a bit, maybe, and particularly that poem, and not being afraid to really go with the rhythm and to have lots of crashing rhymes and for it to be a sound poem as much as anything, and that was very liberating. I don't know that that's true of all the poems in the book, but prose works differently. I think some of the early prose bits, or maybe as if, there's the ghost of poetry there, but then the last couple of novels, I don't think there's been much poetry in them. So it's quite good for the poetry to come back as poetry and not seeping into the prose in the same way. Not really sure that answers your question, but there was, the energy came back suddenly.
Words. One thing that I've found in writing is in the end your vocabulary
can become so limited to your own identity. How do you find new words, really? And I mean, it's interesting in this poems that you would take. You're taking language from, the automated
the shop
message,
wall.
and those are all really interesting linguistic forms.
That's just sort of stealing the cliches and playing with them, whereas something like the Shingle Street poem, they are new and made up words, but they're knocking against each other, and so some of them are less usual words. That's true.
Louis.
They're quite difficult to make up words, but I do occasionally. It's a difficult challenge.
The microphone coming. Oh, it's there.
Oh, right. Sorry.
You raised the question of your doctor parents talking to you about death.
Yeah.
It's something the British seem to me very inadequate about, and it raises a different question which perhaps you, with your skill with words, could help do something about, which is changing the culture on organ donation. It seems to me we don't talk about death enough, and we don't talk enough about the one thing that you can helpfully do to help another human being when you die.
Right.
So, a poem, please.
Okay, so that sounds like this poem. This poem is my donation. Thank you. I'll just want to think about it. Yeah. I agree with you about the point you're making very much.
Could we have a reading from the Yorkshire Ripper?
Takes about 20 minutes, but and there's a 5-minute sign up going on.
Yes.
I could read a little bit from the beginning if you like, just to get the sound of it in the dialect. There is at the top that little quote that what Peter Sutcliffe said to Carl, his brother Carl. I was just cleaning up streets, our kid, just cleaning up streets. Oh, at Tills of Bingley, storm clouds clap. Oh, stand up. Oh, at Tills of Bingley, storm clouds clap and drain, like open blood-black blisters, leaking pus and pain. Ale teems down like stair rods, and swells canals and becks, and fills up stud-marked gull-mouths, and bursts on mind like sex. 'Cause sex is like a storm clap, a swelling in these cells, when lightning arrows through thee, and thou knows that intout tells. I felt it in me senlight, iking home, part fresh, at limestone outcrops, like knuckles white through flesh. How men clap down on women, to hold them there for good, and soak up all their softness, and launder them with blood. It's then I think on Ripper, and what he did, and why, and how me mates ate women, and how Pete made 'em die. I love 'em for me sen-like, their skimmering lips and eyes, their ankles light as ginny spins, their seggy wisps and sighs, and look at 'em's kindred. But mates all say they're not, that men must have tolerance, or world will go to rot. Lad looping moles and gadabouts, fellafond and sly, flappy skets and drabble tails who bleed a bloke bone dry. That's how I hear 'em spoke of, when lads are on their tod, and how thou's got to leather 'em to stop 'em gint and nod. And summat same in Bible where Paul screams fit to bust how men are fallen creatures, but women folk at worst. Now, I reckon this fired Peter, and mentalk were his god, and culprit were our beldering God and his ancient bullying road. No, Pete weren't drove by vengeance, round twistedness or ale, but to show his sen a bawfy man. But let me tell it tale. Well, I can't tell it tale. I mean, I was talking about the misogyny inscribed in the language, and you do get it in that bit, the flappy skirt. That's a word, a dialect word for a loose woman, a flapping skirt, an obvious one, and there are a lot of them. And, it seems to me, actually, I'd like to think that poem is really dated, but that problem persists, does it not, of male supremacy and abuse of women throughout the world. And,
yes, nothing very much dated about it, really.
No,
I mean, it's a universal, recurring phenomenon, and a hidden one, so much. Somebody give us 2 minutes. One last question, or possibly a last poem.
What's the question? No, I think, can we do both? I'll do a very short poem.
I guess I'm just wondering kind of what this kind of experience is like for you, actually, right here and now, sitting here talking about your work and being asked questions about it and people putting sort of different interpretations and things on it. What that's like for you and how different that is from your experience of writing and why you do it. Because I suspect they're very different.
It's great, because spend all your time alone in a room and here you all are. It's lovely. Don't mind answering questions. It's fine. I could never. Still at university, I couldn't speak in seminars. I'd blush. I could not speak in public. So that has been something gradually over the years you learn to do and not mind doing.
Does it surprise you when someone in an audience such as we have today puts a totally different spin on something that you've written?
But
poems are not so directive that you have to take a particular view on the page.
I mean, obviously, if it was the opposite of what you intended, and that occasionally has happened, I've been maligned as I see it. You get upset, but generally, I think it's fine for texts that are open to interpretation. Have to be.
Another poem.
Well, I don't know. What have we got? This one might be too long. I just quite like to read one finish with one about my mother, because fair's fair. Done my dad. Towards the end of her life, my mother had a little time in a convalescent home called Gisborne Park. The point being that she, much younger, when she was young, she used to go to this place. It was a private home then, and to dances and so on. And I could remember pleading whether not to leave me with a babysitter and so on. So to find this place of fun was now the place where she was towards the end of her life. There was something in that, and that's what gave rise to this poem written in rhyming couplets. The thin-ribbed pillars in the entrance hall are the ones you came through for the hunt ball. Beyond reception and the waiting wheelchairs was where you drank champagne by marble sculptures, or at the long white table helped yourself to salmon, Aylesbury duckling or roast beef. The talk was horsey, point to point, livery, who was riding who. You shut up and ate the puree, knowing after port and coffee you'd pass out into the floodlit garden to waltz and foxtrot, where a band played in the sagging striped marquee. Today there's just a lawn, 6 hoops in it for croquet, rusting now, as if the spirit had slipped through them of the place and the era and of you. But the floor upstairs, where you queued in 50s dresses for the ladies, is crowded still, with nurses at their stations to direct me to the room where you lie, worn and name-tagged, like a pilgrim at journey's end. I hold your hand as I held it then, seeing you dressed and powdered to go out. A child beside myself, unable to stop, again and again pleading for you to stay. And again, now, despite myself, by your bed, pleading the same.
I think we're done. I hardly need to say thank you, because I think you've just done it. Blake is, I think you're going to sign books,
Yeah.
aren't you, through that? So please do go and, but thank you very much for coming, and thank you for being a teacher.